study. I passed out a map this evening, and let me make comment on that before we get on into the rest of the Bible study. If you'll notice, on one side we have a sort of a large, the map has something on both sides, and let's start on the side that sort of gives the overview. You'll notice the Tigris and Euphrates River, and you sort of get an overview of the Middle East. You see the Mediterranean and the area down of Egypt and the Nile River down at the very bottom. And you can trace the Exodus sort of across the Red Sea through the Sinai and sort of around in the Sinai and track them on up. And if you will notice where they crossed the Jordan River, there is the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River coming down into the Dead Sea, and you see the area where Israel came across. You can sort of track their, because the map is black and white, you have to, there's not a separate color on there, but you can sort of track it across and see where they came, where they were, and in relationship to the other major areas. Now, if you you might notice Petra on here as well, which is where the children of Israel did spend some time during their period in the wilderness. Now, if you will turn the map over, you will see a more detail, and the progression of the children of Israel is rather lightly drawn, but if you will look from Petra coming up, there is a line that brings you up to the area of Mount Nebo, and you see where they crossed the Jordan River right there above the Dead Sea, Gilgal and Jericho, going on to Ai. If you notice here, we have on this map, and you might want to hold on to that, because next Bible study, when we get into the book of Judges, this map will also come in handy. But it gives you an idea here of the both the location of the tribes as Joshua located them. We also see major areas that feature in the book of Joshua. Mount Nebo, of course, on the east side of the Jordan, is the place where Moses died. That is the place where Moses saw the promised land from atop Mount Nebo, died and was buried there. Israel was in the plains and then crossed the Jordan River. Gilgal is the area where the men were circumcised, just immediately across the river, and then Jericho, which was the sort of the great fortress city of the Canaanites, lay just beyond Gilgal. Gilgal was actually a name given to that area where Israel encamped. It was not a Canaanite city. It was a name that was given there to the hill where the Israelites encamped, the first place where the tabernacle was set up. Then we find moving on to Jericho, which the first portion of the book of Joshua deals with, and then from Jericho on to the city of Ai, which was a tiny little town. Now, if you'll notice, right down below Ai, you find the village of Gibeah, and we will see the role that they played a little bit later. Up above Ai, you find Bethel, which of course had played a role in from the book of Genesis on. Up just slightly above above Bethel is Shiloh, which is the area where the tabernacle was set up toward the end of the period, and where the tabernacle remained for several centuries. The tabernacle remained in Shiloh down to the death of Eli in right after the book of Judges, or let's say the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel. Then Shechem you find up north of Shiloh. This is where we will see in the book of Joshua where Joshua addressed the people toward the end of his life. Just above there, you notice Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. These play a role in the book of Deuteronomy. You remember instructions were given that the people were to be assembled there at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal for the blessings and the cursings after Joshua led them across. So you see that much of the activity of the book of Joshua centers right in this immediate area that ultimately became the inheritance of Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim. Now, if you notice down on the coast, the southern part of the Mediterranean coast, you notice several of the Canaanite cities: Ekron, Gath, Lachish, Gaza. By the way, the Philistines are still in Gaza. That's they call Palestinians today. It's just that actually comes from the Roman spelling of Philistine. The Gaza Strip and that area, which is the center of Palestinian settlement, you find things have not changed a whole lot in the Middle East. They're still going at it and having some of the same difficulties with the same groups of people. If you note on here, the Jordan River is a dividing area between that's referred to as the east side of the Jordan and the west side of the Jordan. Manasseh, or Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh had an inheritance on the east side of the Jordan. That was what they had requested. And their armies, their men, went with the rest of the Israelites to cross the Jordan and went on in. And you see where the other tribes ultimately received their inheritance. But most of the activity of the book of Joshua is centered in this immediate area, just as we see here, where most of the towns are that you find on the map, from Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal on down to Gibeah. That's where most of the activity that we will encounter. Now, the book of Joshua picks up the history of Israel following the death of Moses, which we read at the conclusion of the book of Deuteronomy, and carries it through a period of about 25 years. That's the figure that Josephus uses. The book of Joshua tells the story of the conquest and the division of the Promised Land. One of the primary themes that runs through the book of Joshua is the theme of conquest, and the fact that conquest is possible when God's power is utilized. You find the irresistible power of God's people in overcoming the world and taking possession of their promised inheritance. But that ability to conquer, that ability to move forward, that ability to utilize the power of God is only available as long as the people maintain trust in God and their trust in God's strength, and that they permit no sin of disobedience to break their covenant relationship with Him. Now, we're going to notice that as we go on through, and we're going to see that there are several different things that come out here in the book of Joshua, several different primary themes that run through the story. Now, Joshua opens with what happened after the death of Moses, that God addressed Joshua, told him, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Arise and go over this Jordan." You see, and this is an important thing to realize, that God has raised up servants down through the centuries. When one of God's servants dies, that doesn't mean that there's nothing left to do. Moses, God's servant, was dead. God used Moses in a remarkable way. But what was the responsibility of the people of God? To continue to go forward to do what God had called them to do. Moses finished the work that God had for him. But he didn't finish the work of God. The work of God is ongoing. That's still going. And it is a short-sighted view that when we start doing that. God told Joshua, "You arise and go over the Jordan." That's what you were to do. I had made this promise centuries ago to Abraham that I would give the land to the children of Israel. And so he reminds them of all these things and what ultimately their boundaries would be. Tells Joshua in verse 5, "Nobody will be able to stand before you. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you nor forsake you." You see, one of the key things to remember is God will not let us down. Now, as we go on through chapter 1, it becomes apparent that it is possible for us to let God down. God, if there's a problem, the problem's not going to be on God's side. It's not going to be because God got tired. God went to sleep. God took a trip and He didn't hear. I will not fail you nor forsake you. God is not going to let us down. But what do we have to do? Be strong and of good courage. For unto this people you shall divide for an inheritance the land. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law, which Moses my servant commanded you. Turn not to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper whithersoever you go. So, you see, in order to fulfill the promises, Joshua had to do something. He had to exercise strength and courage. He had to go forward. He had to observe to do what God had instructed. Not turning aside, not going to the right hand or to the left, but simply following God's instructions. That enables us to prosper. When we do what God says, the blessing is there. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate therein day and night. Not only are we to read the law, read God's Word, we are to meditate on it. That means you think about it. If you read it and you don't ever think about what you've read, it just sort of goes in one ear and out the other. We read it and then we think about it. Think in terms of how to apply those principles, how to personalize those things. That's so that we may observe to do it. And that will make our way prosperous and successful, as he says here in verse 8. You see, the key, God's blessings were contingent. So God continues to exhort Joshua and then told him to pass through the host and prepare. Within 3 days they'll pass over the Jordan. And then we look at the matter of the Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Now they had already been promised an inheritance on the east side of the Jordan, which is where the people were at this point. Notice here, Joshua spoke, verse 13, "Remember the word which Moses the servant of the Lord commanded you, saying, The Lord your God has given you rest, and has given you this land. But your wives and your little ones, your cattle will remain here, but you pass on before the brethren armed, mighty men of valor, help them, until the Lord has given your brethren rest." Now, one of the things that we find coming through the book of Joshua is the theme of rest. Now, that is a meaningful theme if you have been on the move for 40 years. Staying in one spot for a few days, sometimes just one day, sometimes maybe a few days or a week or two. But you're living in a tent, and every so often you have to pack up that tent and all your possessions, and you walk, and you go a little further. And you have, for 40 years, not been in one spot for very long. You keep moving. You are a traveler. You are on a journey. And you're continually moving. You don't have any place to put down any roots. The most substantial thing you have is a tent. If somebody came along and said, "How would you like rest?" that seemed like a pretty good idea. Walking for 40 years get sort of old every few days. There was nothing permanent throughout their journey. 40 years, you realize a lot of the people had grown up, and that's all they'd ever known. I mean, anybody 40 and old and younger, in fact, for that matter, really about 45 and younger, because anybody younger than 45 really wouldn't remember anything other than what they were doing. And of course, you remember that there is virtually no one 60 and above. So they had all died in the wilderness. Everybody, all the men that were 20 and up, with just the exception of Joshua and Caleb, had died in the wilderness. So here we find this reference to rest, and we're going to see that theme run through the book of Joshua. You see, Paul picks that up in Hebrews 3 and 4. And he talks about people entering into God's rest and people not entering into God's rest. And he talked about the fact that if Joshua had truly given them rest, if that was all there was, then God would not afterward have spoken of another place of rest. Because, you see, what Paul addressed was the fact that here Joshua was talking about entering into rest. And they entered into a physical rest. We'll see as we go through. But that was not the ultimate of what God meant when the subject of rest was addressed in Deuteronomy and in the book of Joshua. Later on in the Psalms, David refers to entering into God's rest. Paul quotes that. You see, David was writing 4 centuries after the book of Joshua. Paul quotes what David wrote in the Psalms, quotes it in Hebrews 3 and 4, and said, you see, if what Joshua did was the ultimate fulfillment, David would not have been talking about many years later entering into God's rest. So Paul picks it up and he says, obviously there is more to this than simply entering the promised land as the people did. You see, ultimately we are looking to enter God's rest. That's the theme Paul addresses in Hebrews 3 and 4. There remains therefore a promise unto us of entering into His rest. And then he talks about in Hebrews 3 and 4, some of those that came out of Egypt with Moses didn't enter in. Why didn't they enter in? Because of unbelief. And so Paul addresses that theme and gives spiritual principles that derive from the story of Numbers and Joshua. Numbers particularly, because that gives most of the story of what happened in the wilderness, and the book of Joshua, because that is where that theme of rest comes in. So the agreement that Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh had made was they were not trying to get out of something. They were fully prepared to go with their brethren and to help them subdue the promised land. It's just that they were pleased with the area there where they were. And so that was agreed to. Once their brethren had been given rest, they would return there to their inheritance. And so in chapter 2, Joshua sent 2 men to spy secretly, saying, go view the land, even Jericho. Now, I think it's interesting Joshua only sent 2 spies. 40 years earlier, Moses had sent 12, and only 2 of them came back with a proper report, Joshua and Caleb. Evidently, Joshua had decided, there was no point in sending 12. That might lead into trouble. He'd handpick 2 and send those. So they did. And they came there to Rahab's. Now, they stayed here in at the home of Rahab the harlot. This was undoubtedly an inn. The Hebrew word for harlot and innkeeper are the same. That was seems to have been generally what happened at inns. They had they were sort of the no-tell motel of the day, and but anyway, we find Rahab figures prominently in the story. She's introduced here in Joshua 2. We find her, of course, mentioned back in Hebrews 11 as one of the women of faith who, you see, God has called people out of all sorts of backgrounds. Remember, Christ told the Pharisees, the publicans and the harlots will enter into the kingdom before you. Here was a woman that, regardless of what her background had been, came to believe God. Now, you know, everybody else had heard the same stories. Don't you think the departure of Israel from Egypt was something that had made quite a stir? That had only been 40 years earlier. Then, just a matter, of a short time, here they've come up, they've gone through all these things. The Canaanite kings east of the Jordan have been overcome. And we find that Rahab had come in all of this, as she had looked at it, she was convinced that the God of Israel was the true God, and that nothing would stand in the way of the Israelites overcoming Jericho and the rest of the land of Canaan. And so she made a decision to trust God and to trust in the God of Israel, and she helped these spies so we find the story here in chapter 2 of how Rahab hid the men and then let them down. Her inn was right there in the city wall, actually built into the city wall, and she let them down from a window over the outside of the wall and let them down at night, and they were able to get away. And she, in that sense, put her life in jeopardy to let them get away. And they were able to successfully do that. And you read the story here in chapter 2. So she had asked for one thing. She had asked that when they came in to take the land, which she knew they would, to spare her and her family. And she was told that was to gather her family there in the all in the same place, and to pull a scarlet thread in the window that she let them down by, and bring her household there, and that if they would stay inside of there, that way they would be protected. They wouldn't be, there wouldn't be confusion. So anyway, this was what was agreed on. Well, the spies came back and told Joshua all the things that had happened. And Joshua said, "Truly, the Lord has delivered into our hands all the land." Verse 24. What they found was the people in Jericho were frightened. Many of them were frightened of what was coming. Well, early the next morning, chapter 3, they arose came to the Jordan. And you read the story of the crossing of the Jordan. That's the way that God was going to bring them into the promised land. Now, there are perhaps other ways He could have done it. You can look at the map. But God led them in a particular way to bring them to a point, brought them to the Jordan at flood stage in the spring, to demonstrate His hand, His might, His power. And the way it was done was the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant were to walk down to the Jordan and to come to the edge of the river. And when their feet touched the edge of the river, that the Jordan would cease flowing from where it was. So it would just like it would stop. And so, of course, what happens is the riverbed begins to drain on out. If no water keeps coming, then it just everything drains on out. And the bottom of the Jordan was very rocky, so it was a matter that within a very short time they were able to come across. Now, the priests that bore the ark, as the riverbed drained out, they walked out into the midst of the riverbed, and they stood there carrying the ark. And they stood there in the midst of the riverbed, and all the Israelites came across. And this must have taken a number of hours. It describes the detail. They stood there until the Israelites had passed over. And then, after they had crossed, Joshua was instructed by God to take 12 men, a man out of every tribe, go into the midst where the priests were standing and find 12 stones. Each man would carry a stone and bring it back there to the edge, and they were to build a memorial. Build this a pile of stones from the middle of the river as a memorial of what God had done. And of course, once this was the priests, verse 10, which bore the ark, stood in the midst of the Jordan. Everything was finished. They built this little memorial there. And so when all the people were clean passed over, then the priests came across with the ark. Now, you find this large group that had come over into the plains of Jericho. Verse 14, on that day the Lord magnified Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him. You see, God demonstrated His power that He was working through Joshua. And so the priests had come up, and we're told in verse 19, the people came out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, just a matter of a few days before Passover. They encamped in Gilgal. And Joshua took the 12 stones and pitched them in Gilgal, and said, this is to be there for a reminder. Verse 24, that all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that you may fear the eternal your God forever. So right after Joshua came up there, after they crossed the land, we find that after they crossed the river, that Joshua, verse 3, made sharp knives and circumcised the children of Israel. And this is where the name Gibeon came from. That it refers here to this this hill of circumcision. And now what we find is that they were circumcised right before the Passover, so that they could keep the Passover. Verse 8, people abode in their places. The Lord said to Joshua, verse 9, this day have I rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off of you, wherefore the name of the place is called Gilgal unto this day. Gilgal means rolling. The children of Israel encamped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at evening in the plains of Jericho. And that they did eat of the... Now the Jewish translation is clearer, and they did eat of the new produce of the land on the morrow after the Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn in the selfsame day, and the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten. Now this is an important point. The Sonsino commentary, which is Jewish commentary, gives a clear explanation of this section. When you go back to Leviticus 23, just hold your place here and let's turn back a few pages. Leviticus 23. God gave them the instructions about the Passover and the days of unleavened bread. Verse 5 of Leviticus 23, the 14th day of the first month at evening is the Lord's Passover. On the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it goes on through. 7 days you're to eat unleavened bread. Verse 8, the 7th day is a holy convocation. Now notice verse 9. The Lord said unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you be come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, then you shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest to the priest. You see, this was something that could not be carried out. At the time it was given, it was 40 years before it could be carried out. They could do the other. They could observe the Passover. They could eat. They could observe the days of unleavened bread. But when you come into the land which I give you, then you bring a sheaf of the first fruits. You bring it, verse 11, on the morrow after the Sabbath. The priest shall wave it, and you offer it that day. Verse 14, you shall eat neither bread, nor parched corn, nor green ears, until the selfsame day that you've brought an offering to your God. And verse 15, you count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. The morrow after the 7th Sabbath you'll number 50 days. And this is the day of first fruits harvest, or the Feast of Weeks, what we call Pentecost. But notice there was a key element here that could only begin once they had entered the land. They were told they were not to eat of any of the fresh produce until the wave sheaf had been offered to God. Once they came into the land, they were to take the wave sheaf. This was to be done on the morrow after the Sabbath. This is during the days of unleavened bread. Now, when you look at Joshua chapter 5, Joshua chapter 5, they kept the Passover, and they ate of the produce of the land on the day after the Passover. In other words, on the first holy day of unleavened bread, they ate of the they ate of the produce. And the next day, the manna ceased. Now, they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. Now, when you line it up, there's generally, this solves a problem, by the way, that comes up every few years. This is the area we go to resolve the problem. Normally, like this year, for instance, it's no problem to figure what is the morrow after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. The days of unleavened bread, first holy day was on Thursday. A couple of days later was the weekly Sabbath, and then the day after that was Sunday. That was the day of the wave sheaf, and that's the day you begin to count Pentecost. 7 Sabbaths. 7 weeks. Now, sometimes we find that Passover is celebrated on a Thursday evening, which means Friday is the daylight portion of Passover. The night to be observed is Friday night. And the weekly Sabbath is the first holy day. And the following Friday is the last holy day. Now, when you come up with a situation like that, what is the morrow after the Sabbath? What Sabbath are we looking at? You could look at it differently, where the days of it comes through. Sometimes you have a separation between the Sabbath and the Sunday. What if the days of unleavened bread end up that way? How do you do it? Well, what we find right here is clearly the first holy day of unleavened bread this year had to have been. It had to have been this way, where the first holy day of unleavened bread this year was on a Sunday, because they couldn't eat of the new grain until the wave sheaf was offered. Here, the days of unleavened bread begin on a Sunday and end on a Saturday. That doesn't happen very often, but it does happen occasionally. Which Sunday do you count from? The Sunday that's the beginning, or if you look at the problem, normally you have a Sunday that follows a Sabbath. But when the first holy day is on a Sunday and it ends with a Saturday, you don't have a Sunday following a Saturday within the days of unleavened bread. So which end of it do you count from to come up with Pentecost? Because it makes a week's worth of difference. Here is the scripture that we go to clearly define it, that they ate of the produce on the day after the Passover, which was the first holy day. Clearly, then, that was the day that the wave sheaf was offered, because the wave sheaf has to be offered during the days of unleavened bread. That's what this makes plain. You see, in the case of where you start on a Sunday and end on a Saturday, the wave sheaf has to be offered during the days of unleavened bread. And when it is, this was the first holy day. The wave sheaf was offered on the morning of the first holy day, which was a Sunday. And the people then were free to eat of the produce of the land. And the next day, you see, the wave sheaf was offered, and they ate what they wanted. They could pluck off some. God didn't stop the manna until the following day, because there really was the next day before they were able to do work of doing any serious harvesting. So He gave them an extra day of manna because of that. But anyway, it lays it out here when you put this together with back in Leviticus 23. This is well explained in the Sonsino commentary, that the layout of the week here. As we come on down, we find that Jericho, chapter 6, was straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out, none came in. They prepared themselves for a siege. Now, God told Joshua to compass the city. All the men of war, verse 3, go around about the city once, and you do this 6 days. The 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And the 7th day you shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall ascend up, every man straight before him. So this is exactly what happened. It becomes apparent. You see, here are the people of God moving forward. And there's nothing that's too overwhelming for God to do. What battle is it that God can't successfully fight? Now, God gave Joshua instructions and wanted to make it plain. Here was this great fortress city. God wanted to make it plain that He was the one who had overcome the city. So you read the story, and they went on down, and they were told now that verse 17, the city shall be accursed, everything and all that are therein. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and those that are with her in her house, because she hid the messengers. You know where else Rahab is mentioned? She's mentioned in Hebrews 11. You know where else in the New Testament? In the book of Matthew, when it gives the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Interestingly, only 4 women are mentioned in the genealogy. God could have named all the women. Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, who figure significantly in the Old Testament, aren't mentioned in that listing there in Matthew. Only 4 women, and I think it's an interesting study when you go through it. In each case, they were women who were tainted, as it would be looked at. Tamar, if you remember, who seduced her father-in-law, played this trick on Judah, and became the mother of his, of his 2 sons, Pharez and Zerah. Then Rahab the harlot is next. And then we read of Ruth the Moabitess, who married Boaz. Boaz was evidently like the son of Rahab when you put the story together. Then you come all the way down. The fourth one it mentions is Bathsheba, through whom David conceived Solomon and Nathan. It's interesting, the ones that God picks out that I think gives a little bit of food for thought. That is there. I think among other things there may be some things you could make out, but I think that one of the things that it emphasizes, in the line of the Messiah, Jesus Christ came to make possible the blotting out of sin. And here are individuals who came out of pagan, idolatrous backgrounds, individuals who were tainted as anyone would look at it. And yet it was possible for those individuals who, to repent and to be, in that sense, heirs of the promises. The Messiah came through them. And I think there's an interesting, some interesting lessons that can be looked at. Rahab they were told in verse 18 to keep themselves from the accursed thing, lest they make themselves accursed. All the silver, verse 19, gold, vessels of brass and iron are consecrated to the Lord. So we find that the people shouted when the priest blew the trumpet. The wall fell down flat. It's interesting. There have been some excavation studies over there, and the walls of Jericho are just exactly what you would expect. They fell down in a remarkable way, and you can actually see it when you look at in terms of the way of going up. There's one section of the wall that did not collapse the way the other did. It's interesting. It's obscured because some of there was a very good article several years ago in Biblical Archaeology Review that lined it up and showed it. Many of the archaeologists have tried to date it. They misdate the Exodus. They don't date it. They're 2 centuries off in dating the Exodus because they don't use what the Bible said. And if you don't use what the Bible says, you run into problems coming up with a date. If you use the Bible clearly says that Solomon began the temple 480 years after the Exodus. It's the 4th year of Solomon, and it dates it exactly. So it's most of them pretty well agree on when the 4th year of Solomon was. I mean, they may vary 3 or 4 years, but it's with nobody argues that more than just a few years one way or the other. But instead of taking that simple biblical statement and then just going back to do the Exodus, they try everything except just following the book. And so then they come up with these other dates. Generally, most scholars, contemporary scholars, date the Exodus down in the 1200s, almost 200 years after the Exodus, about 200 years after the Exodus. So that's anyway. Now, here we find that they came in, they destroyed the city, they burned it with fire, and these vessels were put into the treasury. Rahab and her household were saved alive. And what we find in Joshua chapter 7 is a problem. The children of Israel committed a trespass in the accursed thing, for Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took of the accursed thing, and the anger of the Lord was kindled. Now, most people didn't know that he had taken it. But you see, God expects His people to be pure and clean. And there are sins for which God will remove His blessing. Here we find Jericho couldn't stand before the people of God. They were obedient to God. They had taken upon themselves the sign of the covenant. And God performed a great miracle and brought the walls of Jericho down. Now we come into chapter 7 and we see that they went to this little village of Ai, which was a short distance. And we find that the men of Ai came roaring out of the town and smote 36 of them. And we're told in the end of verse 5, wherefore the hearts of the people melted and became as water. Boy, all the starch went out of them in a hurry. Things didn't go quite so simply this time. Now there was a reason, and Joshua knew something was wrong. God had brought them in to conquer the land, and here they were defeated. Something was clearly wrong. And God made plain to Joshua that a serious sin had been committed. So we find that Israel was brought by tribes, and the tribe of Judah was taken. This is verse 16. Evidently, perhaps the Urim and the Thummim were used. They went through, and the tribe of Judah was the one selected, and then the families of Judah they took by clans there, and then they went down. When they got the right clan, they started going down through the households, and finally it came out to Achan. And Joshua told Achan, he says, what did you do? And Achan said, well, I have sinned. Verse 21, I saw this Babylonish garment, and 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold, and 50 shekels weight, and I coveted them, and I took them. They're hid in the earth in the midst of my tent, and the silver under it. So they went and looked, and sure enough, there it was. And made plain right at the beginning. Boy, this made an impression on people that he intended his instructions to be carried out. And Achan and his family, who evidently were privy to the whole thing, after all, he hid it in the tent, were destroyed. A very serious matter. Often at the beginning of things, God makes plain in a dramatic way how serious certain things are to be taken. Now, God didn't intervene. If you go through the Old Testament, God didn't intervene this dramatically every time somebody committed a sin. But He makes it plain in this account that sin cuts off the people of God from God's blessing. Sin has to be put away. It has to be rooted out. If you start going through and looking at the book of Joshua as a story about conquest, we find the importance of having strength and courage. We find that there's nothing that can stand before the people of God. You look at Jericho. But you also find that sin puts a wall between God and His people. It cuts off the people of God from God's blessing. Now, Joshua was told in chapter 8 to go and go to Ai and destroy it, and he did. So he burned Ai, verse 28, made it a desolation. Now, I'll just comment on verse 29 briefly, because it proves a point. The king of Ai was hanged on a tree until eventide, and as soon as the sun was down, Joshua commanded that they take him down. Now, when does the day end? There were some got into a controversy back several years ago that the day didn't end at sunset. That it was it had to be totally dark. Well, you can go and you can find quite a number of Old Testament references that links up the day being over when the sun was down. He was hung there until evening. As soon as the sun was down, Joshua commanded to take down his carcass from the tree. And that is just that is one of the things that one of the examples of that as you come on back that you find the same the same thing that one other example we might note of that, Joshua 10 verse 26. Afterward Joshua smote them and slew them and hanged them on 5 trees, and they were hanging upon the trees until the evening. And it came to pass at the time of the going down of the sun, that Joshua commanded, and they took them down off the trees. There are places you can go back in the law where it talked about people shall be unclean until evening, even at the going down of the sun. The point is, the Bible defines its own terms. People get all, buggy about suddenly somebody becomes a Hebrew scholar or something on some technical meaning because they've read what some commentary said. But the Bible defines its own terms, and evening begins as soon as the sun is down. I don't know how much more plainly it can be put than Joshua 8:29. As soon as the sun was down, sunset, evening to evening, are we to observe our Sabbaths. Now, they burned Ai, hung the king. Verse 30, Joshua built an altar unto the Lord God of Israel in Mount Ebal. And so they made there this altar. And he wrote there, verse 32, upon the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he wrote in the presence of the children of Israel. And all Israel and their elders and their officers and their judges stood on this side of the ark and on that side before the priests, which bore the ark of the covenant. And half of them over against Mount Gerizim and half of them against Mount Ebal, as Moses had commanded. And verse 34, Joshua then read all the words of the law, the blessings and the cursings, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded which Joshua didn't read before all the congregation. The women, the little ones, the strangers that were conversing among them. That was a long sermon. There was nothing of all that Moses commanded that Joshua didn't read. So that was a long sermon, and everybody was there, the women, the kids, the whole works. So we read here, if you've looked at your map, you see where they went through. You see, as they went from Jericho to Ai, and then from there they went up to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And you get a little bit of an idea as to where they went. Now, they carried that out, and chapter 9, verse 3, the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai. Now, if you look again on the map, you find that Gibeon is down a little bit south of that. They found out what had been done, and they decided that they didn't want to get destroyed. So they dressed these folks up to look like they had made a long trip. And old shoes and old garments and old dry moldy bread. And they came to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal and said, we're coming from a far country. This is in verse 6, chapter 9. And they said, we come from a long ways away. And we want to be your servants. Verse 8. You see, they had heard what had happened. They didn't want to be conquered and destroyed. And so they laid it on pretty thick. See, that they'd come from a long way. Now, Joshua made a mistake. He didn't go to God about it, which is a lesson for us to learn, you see. Sometimes it's easy to just make a decision before you go and pray about it. Joshua should have gone and prayed about it, but he was sort of taken in by this, made peace, made a league with them, and they made an oath. Well, a few days later, they found out that they were neighbors. They lived just over the hill in the other direction. And it goes through and mentions their cities. And so the question came up, what do we do? God had instructed us that all the people of the land were to be destroyed, but we've made an oath. And Joshua, the point was, though, once you've given your word, you stick to it. And I think that's these people were then made, verse 21, hewers of wood and drawers of water unto the congregation. In fact, they were really given to the Levites, verse 27. It made them hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation, for the altar of the Lord, even unto this day, in the place which he should choose. So they became servants there of the Levites and continued to do that. And they were faithful in that all down through the years. I think that here is the real origin of what are called the Falashas, or the black Jews of Ethiopia. After the destruction of Solomon's temple, that's where they fled. And the Levites had made such good Jews out of them that they kept it up for all this time. It's interesting if you look at the influence that they had. Even the so-called practicing Christians of Ethiopia practice many points of the law, even circumcision, all sorts of things. It's interesting. Ethiopia is the only area of Africa that was not made a European colony, unless you're going to take Mussolini's brief occupation there just prior to and during part of World War II. But it was never. It was the people were not enslaved. They were not sold into slavery, and they were not made a colony by the Europeans. Every place else in Africa was. Sort of interesting, I think. To the degree that they've had nothing but trouble since when they overthrew Haile Selassie, and then they started persecuting these people. They wound up being taken to Israel, and Ethiopia has had nothing but trouble and strife and warfare since that time, where for thousands of years up until that period of time, that had been the one area of stability in all of Africa, and the one area that had the only place it's sort of interesting, I think that some of these things, how they come through, and even God's blessing, to the extent that people are applying principles of God's law and are trying to do it. Maybe imperfectly, but you have to say that some of these people did a better job of sticking to what they had agreed to than most of our ancestors did sticking to what they should have done. And there were blessings that they reaped, even as Gentile people, not directly heirs of Abraham, but they took upon themselves that covenant, and God blessed them in many ways and protected them down through those centuries. And the whole land was the better off for their presence there. And once they left, everything has fallen apart over there. It's interesting. Certain lesson to be learned. Now, chapter 10 begins a very interesting story, because the Adonizedek, who was the king of Jerusalem. Now, you remember, look at the title that he took. In ancient times, in the days of Abraham, Melchizedek was there. Melchizedek means Melchizedek means king of Salem, or king of peace. Adonizedek was a Canaanite king, and he took the title. Adonai means Lord. So he took the title Lord of Peace. He was or Lord of Righteousness. Actually, Melchizedek means Lord of Righteousness, or King of Righteousness. Melech is the Hebrew word for king. Melchizedek means King of Righteousness, and then King of Jerusalem, or King of Salem, means King of Peace. Adonizedek called himself, took the title Lord of Righteousness. You see, the Canaanites were familiar with the earlier history of Salem. Had set up his headquarters there in Jerusalem, and decided to go in, and Gibeon had been one of the great cities, one of the royal cities. And so Adonizedek puts together this Canaanite confederation to come in and smite Gibeon, destroy them, because they had made peace with the Israelites. Well, the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua and told him what had happened. And Joshua came from Gilgal and, verse 10, discomfited the Canaanites before Israel, slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and they fled. And there came this great hailstorm, these huge hailstorms. The hailstones came down, and more died with the hailstones than what the Israelites had slain. Well, notice here is one of the remarkable miracles of the Bible, and yet, you know, how remarkable is it? I mean, we think that's really remarkable, but God's the one that created everything. You think it was difficult for Him to answer Joshua's request to make the sun and the moon stand still? This is the account of Joshua's long day, and so what we find is that it's interesting. You know what Joshua describes. The people anciently thought of the sun revolving around the earth. Now, in reality, you know, we talk about sunrise and sunset. In reality, the sun is in the same place, the earth is turning. But if the earth quits, you know, if the earth is stopped in its rotation, which is what has to happen for the sun to stay in the same place, the earth quits going. Well, not only does the sun stand still, but you see the moon would too, because the earth isn't continuing. The earth isn't continuing its movement. The earth is not continuing to rotate here. So it's interesting, you know, that when Joshua described what happened, what he described is from the vantage point of you know, what would have had to have happened, where you know, ancient peoples wouldn't have necessarily connected the two. The sun stood still and the moon stayed until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? The sun stood still in the midst of heaven, hasted not to go down about a whole day. No day like that before it or after it. That the Lord hearkened to the voice of a man, the Lord fought for Israel. Now notice how shortly after the situation in Ai, on the one hand, here was a little tiny village that gave Israel a smashing blow, because sin had separated the people from God. Yet when sin was cleaned out, we find there's no miracle that is too great for God to work on behalf of His people to accomplish His purpose. And it I think, is an important lesson. So you go on through the story here of the defeat of these kings, and then chapter 11 continues on the story of conquest that we come on down to, and chapter 12 continues on the story of the various kings and how they were dealt with when they were overcome. Now chapter 13, verse 1, Joshua was old and stricken in years, and he was told, there's land that yet remains, and he was to divide, verse 7, divide this land for an inheritance unto the 9 tribes and the half-tribe of Manasseh, because Reuben, Gad, and the other half-tribe of Manasseh already had their inheritance. So it goes through the division of the land. Verse 14, only unto the tribe of Levi he gave none inheritance. So we come on down through the story here. Now, notice something as we chapter 14 continues this on, and Now come on down. Let's see, when was this? How long did it take to subdue the land? Chapter 14, verse 5. As the Lord commanded Moses, so the children of Israel did, and they divided the land. Then the children of Judah came unto Joshua in Gilgal. And Caleb said unto him. See, Caleb had been the other faithful spy that had gone in with Joshua. Caleb said, You know the thing that the Lord said unto Moses, the man of God, concerning me and you in Kadesh Barnea. 40 years old was I when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And I brought him word again that was in my heart. My brethren went up, made the heart of the people melt, but I wholly followed the Lord my God. And Moses swore that day, Surely the land whereon your feet have trod shall be your inheritance. Now, verse 10, the Lord has kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years, even since the Lord spoke this word unto Moses, while the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness. And now I am this day 85 years old. Now, how long had Israel been in the wilderness? Or how long had Israel been subduing the land? Well, if you go back, remember the story back in Numbers. When did the children of Israel send the spies into the land? And you read that back in Numbers 13. Well, if you go through the story here in Numbers, you find that this was a year after Israel had come out of Egypt. Numbers chapter 1, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tabernacle of the congregation on the first day of the second month in the second year that they were come out of Egypt. Now you go through and you put the story together. They had come out of Egypt and it had taken them a year because they got slowed down because of the sin at Sinai. You see, the sin keeps slowing you down when you're trying to make progress. They'd have gotten there a long time earlier, but sin slowed them down. See, Moses was in the mount 40 days, and he came back down, and they had sinned. So now we're 1 year, see, the second year since they left Egypt. Caleb said he was how old? He was 40 years old at that time, at the time of the spying. That means he was 39 when they left Egypt. He was 40 when he went in to spy out the land. It had been 1 year since they left Egypt. He had spied out the land. He was 40 years old. Now 45 years had passed. Well, they spent 40 years total in the wilderness. They had spent 1 year until the spies went in. They spent 39 more. The point is, Caleb was 39 when it was 40 years from the Exodus to the time they entered the land. Caleb was 39 when they came out of the land. 40 a year later when he went in to spy. Caleb was therefore 79 at the entrance into the land. Now he was 85. 6 years have passed. What do we find? Subduing the land took 6 years. Now what is the seventh year? That's the sabbatical year, right? That's the year Israel entered into rest. Because that's what we're going to see. See, in Joshua chapter 14 and 15, as we go on, Caleb, dates the whole thing. He's 85, which means this is 46 years after the Exodus. 40 years in the wilderness, 6 years subduing the land. Now, they go through the division of the land, and this whole thing goes through. And in chapter 15, 16, 17, 18, they continue they're casting lots. It's giving the details of the boundaries and all of this. Chapter 19, as we come on down here, chapter 20, chapter 21, that now chapter 22. See, all of this is a lot of chapters devoted to the tales of dividing up the land. That's the way we know where the tribes were placed. But all that's describing these events, you see, 6 years after the entrance into the land. Chapter 22, verse 1. Joshua called the Reubenites, Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and said, "You have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and have obeyed my voice in all that I commanded. You've not left your brethren these many days unto this day." You see, 6 years they had been over here separated from their families. Now, verse 4, "The Lord your God has given rest unto your brethren." We're at the end of 6 years, entering into the 7th year, and this is when Israel entered into rest. And Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe are now told that they can go back over the Jordan and take their inheritance. And so they return, verse 9. And so it's interesting as we note here the connection. Now Israel has now come to the first sabbatical year. They have entered into rest. And you know, if you've been living out of a tent and moving from place to place for all these years, now you see the inheritance is divided up. First lots were cast and everybody was given their spot. That's a contrast. You know, if you go back and read the settling of the West, you know, you've heard of the Oklahoma land rush. Everybody lined up and took off as fast as they could. Well, the guy who's the biggest, the fastest, he gets there first and gets the best spot. That's not what... or starts early. Yes. That's right. A number of them did that.
That's why they call them Sooners.
Yes, Sooners. They got there a little sooner. You see, this was not the way God set it up. He didn't just say, line up at the border, everybody take off and get what you can. Because, you see, God went through and God allocated out the land. And so, therefore, everybody got what was appropriate. I think what we're given is a little bit of insight into what God is going to do in the world tomorrow. He's going to reallocate the land. And each group, each tribe, is going to be given their area. You're not going to have the kind of problems you got over in the Balkans where you got people all there and everybody's trying to take everybody else's land. And they're arguing over who it belongs to. That's been the source of fighting all the way down. You see, God is going to allocate out the land and then it'll belong to you because God gave it to you. And He's not going to allow somebody to come in and crowd out their neighbors. This is the way He set it up in ancient Israel. And so now Israel enters into rest. And there is and they stayed at rest as long as they obeyed God. But once they quit obeying God, then their rest got interrupted. Now, as an interesting story in chapter 22, just for the sake of time, I will briefly recount it. You find that when the 2.5 tribes went back to go over the Jordan, they came up with an idea. They said, we want our descendants to realize, we want everybody to know on in the future our connection. So they got these stones and they built an altar, just like the altar at Shiloh. Now, somebody saw that. And the only exercise some folks get is jumping to conclusions. It's better to jump rope, but they spend their time jumping to conclusions. They saw the altar and they said, you know what those guys are doing? They're starting their own church. They're starting their own religion. They built an altar down there. They're going to start offering sacrifices. I mean, they had it all figured out in their mind what these guys were doing. Bunch of rebels. Let's get an army together and go down and smash them. Well, they were all stirred up, all mad. They were ready to go down and just wipe the whole bunch out. And somebody, somewhere along the line, stopped long enough to ask, what in the world did you guys think you were doing? And then they got the explanation. The last thing that was on their mind was to be starting some rival religion. They said, oh no, we didn't intend to offer sacrifices on it. We built a replica of the altar at Shiloh. So that for on into the future, this would be there as a reminder, as a memorial. Wasn't anything wrong with that. Peace was restored. But it is an important lesson. it illustrates how easily it is for appearances to be deceiving. See, people looked at it and they thought they had it figured out. How many times have we looked at something and thought we had it figured out? Thought we knew. Wasn't any point in asking. I mean, you can look at it and tell. But there is a point in asking. And that's a very valuable lesson for all of us to remember in human relations. It almost brought about a terrible war, a terrible civil war in Israel. It's one of those interesting stories that packs a lesson that can come right on down to us today. We might just notice a couple of things in conclusion. Joshua 18:1, the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle of the congregation there. And the land was subdued before them. The Shiloh was where first Gilgal had been the place when they crossed the river. And Gilgal remained during the 6 years of subduing the land. The tabernacle remained at Gilgal. Now, as they got ready to divide the land and to enter into rest, the tabernacle was moved to Shiloh. The tabernacle stayed in Shiloh. It stayed at rest until the sins of the people. You remember the story in 1 Samuel of Eli and what he allowed his sons to do. And the Philistines were allowed to capture the ark, and the whole thing was disrupted. It's interesting, you find that the tabernacle has moved a number of times over time. You don't. People should never think that Jeremiah used that. People back in his day were saying, "Well, nothing's going to happen to Jerusalem. This is God's city. That's God's temple. God won't let anything happen to it." And Jeremiah said, "Has anybody been to Shiloh lately? It's a plowed field. There's nothing there." And the reason, of course, was because of sin. And I think that is a lesson that can come right on down to our day and to events that God allowed to, in this age of the church, the things He allowed to be built up, and yet because of sin, an evil heart of unbelief, if you really want to get down to it, Shiloh was laid desolate, and it is spiritually desolate, has been for several years. Just again, as we read, these books aren't just simply dead history. They are history, but they're lessons and they're examples and they're things they're principles that illustrate the mind of God. And there are many things that we can derive and we can learn. As we come on down, chapter 24, or verse 6, or verse 1 rather, Joshua gathered the tribes to Shechem, and he gives them this sort of farewell address. Reminds them of the time when their ancestors had lived beyond the Euphrates in the days of Abraham's father, and had served other gods. And I took Abraham, verse 3, from the other side of the river. The King James renders it flood. It is, I think most commentaries will explain that this refers to the Euphrates. It's the river is actually the term that's used here. So Joshua sort of recaps their history a little bit and what had done. And then we come on down. The statement Joshua told the people, verse 23. It's sort of interesting. Joshua said, look, verse 20, if you forsake God and serve other gods, strange gods, then you'll be consumed. Verse 21, the people said, no, we're going to serve the Lord. Joshua said, all right, you're witnesses. Verse 23, now therefore put away the strange gods that are among you. Here, there, we're going to serve God. We're going to be faithful. Joshua says, look, he says, I know you got these little things hidden out there. Get rid of them. Put away the strange gods that you have among you, and incline your heart unto the Lord God of Israel. And so Joshua made a covenant. Verse 26, Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. So Joshua now adds to Scripture. This is the book of Joshua, you see, that was added here to the book of the law. All these things. There is an interesting statement. Joshua wrote these words in the book, set it up, and he took a great stone, verse 26, and set it up there under an oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said unto all the people, This stone shall be a witness unto us, for it has heard all the words of the Lord which he spoke unto us. It shall be therefore a witness unto you, lest you deny your God. Now, I think it's interesting. The only way this stone was a witness. Now, a deaf and mute witness, but it was a witness. It was something that was there. I think the story, as you put it together, is that this was the stone that was taken through the wilderness with Israel. You see, this was, I think, the coronation stone. It was put... A stone to have heard all the words that the Lord had spoken had to have been a stone that Israel took with them through the wilderness. Because so Joshua took this stone and he put it there beside the tabernacle. Later on, in Chronicles, you read several times of the kings crowned on the pillar stone. How they were that this was the case, and later, ultimately, of course, Jeremiah took it to Ireland, and it has been there, the coronation stone, Ireland, Scotland, England. But I think this is one of the references to that. That's not a major point, but the stone of witness here was a stone which had been present when all the words God had spoken were spoken. So clearly it was a stone that had been with them the 40 years. Why would they take a particular stone through the wilderness for 40 years? Well, Jacob had made it, had poured oil upon it and set it apart as the pillar stone, as the sign, or as the stone of Bethel, the house of God. And you can read that back in Genesis. So then, Joshua, verse 28, Joshua let the people depart, every man to his inheritance. It came to pass after these things, Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. As we come on down, verse 31, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, and which had known the works of the Lord which he had done for Israel. And it then mentions Joseph's bones being buried, and Eleazar, Aaron's son, dying, and they buried him, and Phinehas, of course, the grandson, became the high priest. Sort of wraps up the story here of Joshua. But Israel lasted as long as Joshua did. And just a few years beyond sort of the immediate ones that administered Israel right after Joshua's death. But it didn't take long. And that is a lesson. We'll get into that next time when we get into the book of Judges. But with that, we will be concluded here on the book of Joshua this evening.